So first, Keith Humphreys, thank you for talking with me. You are an addiction specialist at Stanford University. You're one of the characters in San Francisco. You're a really great thinker, great researcher. I'm so delighted that you'll talk to me a little bit. Can you just put London Breed's announcement today in context for people?
Yeah, I'm delighted that the mayor is showing leadership on the issue of closing down the open drug scene in the Tenderloin. And because I know she will endure flack for it. It's a case where probably her more affluent and better connected constituents will bristle. But as she said in her announcement, she's been listening to her less well-connected, less politically powerful constituents in the Tenderloin, that they're living in misery. And it is not necessary, and it is an entirely fixable problem, as many cities have shown. So I was just thrilled for them to be taken seriously, and I am admiring the mayor for taking a political risk on behalf of the least powerful people in the city.
And I quote you several times in San Francisco expressing some amount of frustration. You're very careful, you don't name names, but you've been encouraging mayors and policymakers to take very similar actions like the ones that she announced today, which included a crackdown on open air drug dealing, but also other crimes, car break-ins, retail theft. Can you say more about sort of what you think changed, for what the calculus changed in the Breed administration? Anything else to give us some insight into how we got from your frustration, I think speaking to me must have been almost a year ago now, to today?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking to a lot of Pacific Coast policymakers who've been asking me for help with this kind of problem. And, San Francisco is the worst of this sort, but, there are very similar challenges in San Jose, Portland, Seattle. And I don't think we can overestimate the influence of the city of Seattle voting 8% for Donald Trump 2 years ago, and voting 55% for a Republican city attorney in the last election who had pledged a law and order platform. And, that I'm sure scared people about losing control. I mean, scared Democratic policymakers. And I'm not cynical about democracy. I think it's good when politicians take note of how elections are turning out. And I've no doubt that, Mayor Breed is smart. She will have noticed that and thought about it. Also noticed the large number of people who signed a recall initiative for the district attorney, and say, the public is wanting some action here, and she's going to try to deliver it. And this will resonate. I think her announcement will resonate in some of these other cities. I think give courage to some other people, all of whom, by the way, are progressive politicians. I mean, they would be considered liberals if you compare them to Americans as a whole, for sure, but haven't felt able to, in any way, do anything about their addiction problems other than offer lots of services and hope people use them. And I'm a big favor of offering services. They save lives. I'm glad all these cities do it. But a lot of those services are going begging, and a lot of the costs of a growing addiction problem are really starting to bite. Not just the people who have the problem, but the people who live in those neighborhoods, try to raise families there. It's really extremely challenging for them.
Now, is it fair to say that she's going to need the support of the DA in order to implement her plan?
Yes. Mayors can, she needs the police and the DA to go along. So, mayors can, as she has done, ask for money for the law enforcement part. They can provide directions to the police department. They can also be conveners of stature, because a lot of this is about, as you know, getting different political factions to work together, getting health and law enforcement work together. But in the end, you can arrest a lot of people, but then DAs decide who gets charged and for what. So whether or not this succeeds will require the DA to be involved and supportive. And I have no insight. I've never met the DA. I can't comment on what he's thinking, but I hope he will think seriously about it, because this is a chance to, again, advocate for the least politically powerful group in the city. I mean, I suppose some people were reassured when he made a very strong statement after the theft from Louis Vuitton. And for me, they had the opposite effect. I want a DA who is the most worried about the poorest residents and less about Louis Vuitton. And I'm not saying what happened there was right, but I would like the poorest residents to get that same kind of reaction from public officials when they're victimized.
So even if but now if the mayor and the DA did work together and they were able to crack down on the drug dealing and potentially even arrest a fair amount of addicts, do we have the rehab facilities to take care of people that want to go to rehab?
Yeah, that's a great question to which I don't think we know the answer, like how many people would uptake the rehab. But I want to make clear something that may not be evident. Some people will make the argument against this, but there'll still be drug use in San Francisco. Absolutely, there will still be drug use and addiction in San Francisco. This is harm reduction, closing down open air drug scenes. Every city in America has drug problems, but they do not all have a drug scene like San Francisco does. And that has unique harms to it. So even if the number of people using drugs doesn't change a bit, and even if the number of people dealing drugs doesn't change a bit, getting it so that a family can know their kid can walk to school safely through that neighborhood, that there aren't people on the corner with guns in their belt, that there aren't the shootings that we've had, that there isn't the terrifying disorder in that neighborhood, those would be that would be a big win. And I hope people who believe in harm reduction will recognize that this is in fact harm reduction. It is not a fantasy about a drug-free society, which we're never going to have. It's trying to minimize the damage that drugs do. And if they can organize, as I'm sure many European cities have, to close down open air drug markets, including, by the way, Lisbon, which is often cited as we're copying what Lisbon does. That's going to have huge gains for people, particularly in the Tenderloin, but more broadly in the city. So that is my hope, that they'll pursue that and they'll get the support, because there really has to be a consensus for this to work. If any one constituency is really against this, it's very hard to do.
Can you say a little bit more practically what it looks like? She mentioned more police officers. You mentioned closing the open drug scenes, and you referenced Europe. If you were in charge and you wanted this to be as humane and efficacious as possible, what does that look like practically?
Well, it's a good thing for San Francisco I'm not in charge. So what I'm going to tell you is what I know has worked in other cities run by a lot more talented people than me. So people like David Kennedy in New York, or folks who worked in High Point, North Carolina, as well as some of the things that have been done in cities like Zurich, which had a very big open drug scene, even bigger than San Francisco. And essentially, it's a division of responsibility has to be created between health professionals and law enforcement. And in a case of addiction, that is a health issue. Health is in the lead. Police are there to support, but it is the social workers, the doctors, the psychologists, the harm reduction outreach workers who are there to respond to that population. And that may include, for example, in this case, expanding very low threshold services for them if you're going to close down the market. The police, in contrast, have a thing they lead on too, which is closing down open dealing. So that's taking people off the streets who have a weapon in their belt, who have already been arrested 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. And clearly the current regime is not working. There's a particular style of doing this, a sort of concentrated enforcement approach in which police try to shut down the whole market at once. So in other words, rather than just arresting one person, 2 people, which does not do anything, they're very easily replaceable. They instead do buy busts with the every single dealer, meaning, you just get it. It's not hard to do. You get them on film making a sale, but instead of tossing them all in jail, at the same time, you make them an offer as a group. You bring them all in and say, look, here's the cases. We could bust every single one of you now. We're capable of locking you up, but we're going to give you an alternative, which is, if you get out of the business, we won't charge you for this. And we've got service providers here to, maybe you need housing, or maybe you need job support, or whatever it is you need, but you can't do this business anymore. And the experience of places like High Point is with sort of called a low arrest crackdown, is markets often collapse when you do that. There's always a few people who test waters and say, wow, no one else is going to be out there, I'm going to go out there and deal. Well, they're very easy to find. They do get arrested if they make that decision, but the market as a whole breaks down. And one of the other things that seems very commonsensical is that, but if we disrupt it one place, it'll just spread somewhere else. That sounds sensible, but actually empirically, it turns out to be wrong. It takes a certain set of circumstances for an open air drug scene to exist, one of which is lack of enforcement. But once it's set up, it doesn't tend to spread. Those elements don't get concentrated in the same way. So, that's something other cities have done. I'm sure they'd be willing to help San Francisco if San Francisco wants to, do outreach to them, get advice on this. It's entirely doable. And I have no doubt that if we want to do it in a city with so many smart people and so many resources, we can do it.
Now, in San Francisco, most of the drug dealers are from Honduras. They're here, I think it's fair to say, not on green cards, not under traditional channels. Does that change the approach to those dealers in contrast to, say, the dealers in North Carolina?
Yeah, no, it definitely makes so. I thought about that a lot. It does add another layer of complexity of how do you motivate that group who aren't necessarily planning to stay in the community in any way. But there's all that has been true in other cities where dealers are from out of town and don't have connections, and the people who, like David Kennedy, who is to my lights one of the brightest criminologists in the United States, work on that problem, and I think can be helpful if asked.
And so does the drug dealing just move indoors?
Yeah, I mean, there's still, like I said, there's still going to be drug dealing. There's still going to be drug use. There may be less of it overall, but people sometimes say all you've done is driven it underground. Let's not underestimate how great it would be to have things driven underground. If you have a market like you have in a lot of other cities, where it's sort of the pager market with direct contact between dealers and customers, and not everybody clustered in one place, which means far less likelihood of violence. That is a very good thing, even though there's still going to be a lot of drug use and dealing. I mean, a lot of what law enforcement is about is, getting yourself a better class of criminal. The police can never eliminate all drug dealing, but they can set certain parameters on it, which, and they need to communicate those to say, look, we are going, if you are out standing on a street corner selling fentanyl, we are going to arrest you every single time. And the truth is, if you're a furtive drug dealer and you never engage in violence and you don't participate in the open drug market, you're much more likely to get away with it. Now, for a lot of police, that feels like crazy. Why would you tell them your enforcement strategy? Because normally you think we're not going to tell them, we'll surprise them when we make a case. But you're trying to shape a market. So you actually want to have a very clear signal of like, this is what we're going to do toward. This is our number one priority. It is not a secret. Here's how to get arrested in our city. And here's how to dramatically lower your risk for arrest. And, that is, like I say, it may seem a bit strange, but that actually is the way that you use the deterrent power you have, because you can't arrest the whole world.
And how do supervised drug use sites, drug injection or drug smoking sites, which is now, they've opened the first one in New York in the United States. They've existed in Canada, I believe, for the last decade. I believe there's somewhere around 20 of them. How do the supervised drug sites fit into this strategy, or do they? And how would you sort of, what role does it play here, if any, as part of London Breed's agenda?
Yeah, so supervised drug consumption rooms are an issue in drug policy that generates probably 500 times the think pieces and debate than they merit in terms of how important they are. First one was founded, I think, 30 years ago, and there's like maybe 150 on the entire planet, which tells you this is not a particularly scalable intervention. And when they exist, very few people access them. Not many people are going to like travel half an hour to go use drugs. Now, that doesn't diminish the reality that if someone overdoses in front of you, you can save their life. That's terrific. But this is a pretty small intervention. It's going to reach a small number of people for the resources you're putting into it. So whether San Francisco does that, it probably will. That is not going to be the end of civilization, as some people say, nor is it going to make much difference about the epidemic overall. It's going to have to be, it's a question of a much broader strategy is going to help turn the tide.
And do we need to change Prop 47, which is the ballot initiative that passed in 2014, which reduced from a felony to misdemeanor the possession of up to 3 grams of even hard drugs, as well as shoplifting up to $950? Does that ballot initiative need to be changed to have success in terms of ending the open drug scenes?
Well, one thing that's interesting is that, Prop 47 applies to the whole state, but not all states are seeing the surge of property crime and open drug use and open drug scenes. And so I actually think within that, it's entirely possible, let's say Sacramento does, to keep a lid on those kinds of problems. So I wouldn't personally focus on proposition. Every ballot proposition that's ever passed has things wrong with it. That's absolutely conceded. Changing them is a complete pain. So I think we're going to have to make it work, but other cities are doing so. And we have to remember too, is that a misdemeanor is still a crime, so it's not that you can't do anything about it. You can throw somebody in jail for a misdemeanor. I think for up to 6 months, I believe in California. So it's not nothing. And we, for example, for gang shoplifting, things like that, you don't have to charge people a felony to do it, but you do have to decide that you want to prosecute those misdemeanors. And that's something that I think would be more, if I was going to invest a lot of political energy, I would invest on that, more than I would trying to convince the entire state to undo a ballot proposition that passed by a broad margin.
And what percentage of folks that are suffering from addiction would need to have the threat of jail or prison in order to go to rehab? I assume it's a pretty high percentage.
Yeah. So, most people who are addicted do not seek treatment. And that's been true, for my entire career. I mean, there are, addiction is a disease, but it is a different disease than, say, depression or chronic pain or cancer, in that, first off, a lot of the costs are experienced by other people. And the reward, and we got to remember, fentanyl, yes, it ruins people's lives and often kills them, but taking it itself is an immensely rewarding experience. That's why people get addicted to it, right? So you got a case where a disease, the extent there's rewards in it, they're accruing to the person concerned, and the costs are often falling on other people. And that's really different in like, say, depression or cancer, which is just misery every day. And it falls mostly on you, and you will do an awful lot to get out of it and make huge sacrifices. Think of the things people go through with chemotherapy and surgery to be cured of cancer. People who are addicted, are as a population nowhere near as likely to seek it out. And even there's often a lot of ambivalence, about there's certain things about the addiction they like, and say, and I understand that, I know my neuroscience, it's immensely rewarding in the short term. That's why people take them. And so some pressure is very commonly needed for people to change. That does not have to be threaten them with prison at all. But there has to be pressure. Sometimes that comes from just the culture around them. What do the neighbors think? What do passersby on the street think? Sometimes it's friends and family. Sometimes it's, the spouse or the partner. Sometimes it's the boss, at their work. But in San Francisco, for most of the group who's really struggling, they don't have those sources of pressure. A lot of them are from other places. A lot of them have burned out those relationships. Few of them are employed. So those pressures all gone in. We have to be realistic. These are kind of the Western cities in the US are sort of libertarian cities with a pretty strong drug and alcohol culture. I mean, San Francisco is one of the heaviest drinking cities in the United States. It's the heart of cannabis culture and psychedelic culture. So there's not a lot of cultural disapproval, as there is, to contrast it, say, with Lisbon, where there is a lot, even though it's not that people punish much through criminal justice, but it is that it's sort of frowned upon in a way. It just isn't frowned upon, and let it all hang out and be an individual with San Francisco. So as a result, when law enforcement totally leaves the field, sort of the last source of push is removed from a lot of people's lives. And if it was up to me, I would never just pick somebody up and force them into a treatment for the act of using a drug or possessing a drug. But what I would do is when it comes to conduct, like when I use drugs, I commit burglaries and shoplifting, or I threaten people in the street. The conditions of probation and parole, which is where most of those folks will end up, should include regular testing for drugs with sanctions and rewards, like is used. There's examples of this 24/7 sobriety for people who get arrested for drink driving over and over again. Hope probation for people who get arrested for meth-related crimes over and over again. That is a place where you can have leverage, where it's not the kind of violation of civil rights it would be if I just said, I don't like your drug use, so I'm going to subject you to a regime. That's beyond the pale, at least for me, for my values. But once someone becomes a threat to public safety, then there is a rationale for doing that. And the thing about those programs that is important to me is it not only does the person's substance use go down, but also their likelihood of ending up in prison goes down. And so it's not, some will say that seems really cruel, seems really war on drugs. Well, if it lowers their chance of ending up in a prison someday because they've done something really awful, that is not, to me, that's not what the war on drugs is about. It's, reducing prison populations, which is a problem I've worked on my whole career, and really want to, I think, we need to keep moving that way as a society.
And Keith, last question. Sam Quinones wrote this beautiful book. I finally read it.
I've read it too. It's a good book. Yeah.
He makes a big deal out of the increased potency, both of meth and fentanyl over their precursors, both, more ephedrine-based meth and then heroin. It can be a bit daunting, honestly, when you think about how much more potent those drugs are. I'm also a bit daunted by how long so many people have not had any interventions with long-term meth use. It seems like, he's suggesting things like brain damage. Are we at risk of overstating some of those concerns and becoming too discouraged? Or do you think that we need to be much more realistic, and that really it's just going to be a lot harder for folks to give up their addictions if they're on meth and fentanyl? I mean, how do you balance not being too discouraged while recognizing the changing drugs?
Yeah, well, the sort of syntheticization of our drugs is a frightening prospect, and fentanyl particularly has broken a lot of things that seem to be working, reasonably well at some point, but its ability to addict and its ability to end life just outstrips anything else we face. And you'd have to go back to when heroin first appeared, and was one of the reasons morphine disappeared, because it was so much, less potent. So there's reasons to be concerned about that. There's also the reality that meth and fentanyl are free of agriculture. So one of the ways we used to reduce drug control would be you work with countries, you reduce the farming, you catch bales in the Caribbean, and yes, you don't get a huge amount of it gets in, but you could put some constraint on it. But now we have drugs that can be made essentially anywhere in great quantities, are very cheap and very available, and those are super serious problems. And I don't have a lot of smart people are thinking about this, and I don't have a quick and simple answer, but I do know that even given that there will be a supply of drugs and they're being sold, there's dramatic differences in what those markets are like around this country and around the world. And San Francisco has a dreadful one. And there's nothing inherent about San Francisco that says they can't have a far less disorderly, violent, and open drug market. And that should be the priority. And there's nothing that says we can't still offer and should offer, as many services as we can to treat addiction for those who seek it, and use the levers we have for those people who threaten public safety or therefore the criminal justice system. We have to do all those things at the same time, and it is hard, very hard, and it's also heartbreaking. It's emotionally difficult to interact with people who are doing bad things, and they make us angry, they make us scared, and at the same time are also often suffering horribly themselves, and therefore we want to be helpful, and it's tough to hold all that in one's heart. But it's a big-hearted city. I think San Francisco can do it.
Hey, one final thing that just struck me. I heard some talk about a potential vaccine for addiction. Is that anywhere in the realm of the possible? Where are we at with that?
Yeah,
as a possibility?
It's been the 10 years away for about 20 years now. The the basic idea, it's not a vaccine in the traditional sense of a preventive vaccine, but a therapeutic vaccine, for example, would produce an antibody that would cluster around, like when you, let's say you took cocaine or something, would cluster around and preventing it from binding in your brain at the high levels. It's very clever tech, but it's never really worked despite quite a bit of effort, in part because it doesn't resolve the basic motivational question of, would a person ever take it? And they have to decide to keep taking it, for it to last. And that problem never goes away. Same thing with, we have terrific medications, thank goodness, but that doesn't resolve, pills don't hop into our mouth each day. So it doesn't resolve that sort of motivational question of, why would this person want to do this and enter into a life of recovery really different from the one they have now, which they can't really see at the moment. It almost seems like a fantasy that their lives could be dramatically different. And you have to solve that problem no matter what high-tech tools you have to use in treatment.
And sorry, one final thing, Keith. It seems like at one point I read something of yours where it seemed like you had more faith in kind of in drug interdiction at a higher level than maybe I did. I think I felt like it's just, we have tunnels and drones and FedEx and too many ways to bring in highly concentrated drugs. But do you still think there's some kind of role for supply interdiction at an international or border level?
Yeah, I do. Very generally, there's a big difference. You get a lot from routine enforcement of laws. Like, we arrest people for, burglary, even though there's always going to be burglaries, right? And that's because if the rule became burglary is 100% legal, if you can do it whenever you feel like, things would be an awful lot worse. So you need a certain amount of routine enforcement to maintain supply control. And to the extent you can take out uniquely valuable people, that can be highly productive. There was a massive drug bust in Australia, which created the heroin drought. And the latest, studies of that showed over the next decade, it saved thousands and thousands of people's lives. But you have to, it's not going to be about arresting somebody who has an 8th grade education standing on a corner, slinging drugs. But if you get to people like expert chemists or people who can move large sums of money, launder money, or who can make international connections, all those kinds of things that are, sort of the high skilled people, that kind of enforcement is really valuable, and I think a good investment.
Keith, thanks so much. Anything I didn't ask that you want to add? Anything happening at the Biden White House level that you think is important? Are they doing what you want to see them doing, or they need to do something else?
Yeah, there's one thing I want to add, which is I really respect the fact that Mayor Breed listened to and is citing people who live in the Tenderloin as she rolled this out. And I will hope anyone who doesn't live in the Tenderloin does not dismiss what it's like to live there. It's very easy to sit in Nob Hill, for example, or Seacliff and say, I oppose the war on drugs, so I don't think we should do anything about the drug market. But would you tolerate it outside your front door? And I don't think people would. So, we need to listen to people who are dealing with the cost of it and be led by them. And that's really important. In terms of ONDCP, the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, they've gotten out model legislation on syringe exchange programs, which is a good thing to do. Model legislation means they've had basically high-level lawyers write it all for you. So for states may not have the resources, they can just take that and they can pass it. That's certainly a good thing. They have, they're being run by a physician, Dr. Rahul Gupta, who I know pretty well from back home, West Virginia, and I'm very excited that it's a physician. That hasn't happened, physician hasn't had a leading role in American drug policy since like the 1970s. So I think that is certainly also exciting. And then the Build Back Better has quite a bit it has a lot of things in it, but also has some money for this problem on things like overdose prevention and expansions of treatment, even expanding Medicaid, which is, speaking of an issue that really does matter a whole lot more than whether we have 50 or 100 supervised consumption sites around the United States. We have millions of people with no insurance at all and they get nothing. So even, anywhere we can expand Medicaid to fill that gap and give people access to care for addiction, but also all the other health problems that are very common in this population. That's very good. And I know that they are doing it absolutely as much as they can in a closely divided Congress.
Thanks so much, Keith. This was really helpful. I'll post
Great
it
to
right
see
away.
you. Great to
You
see you.
too.
Good luck with your show tomorrow.
Thanks so much.
Sure thing. Bye-bye.
Take it easy. Okay, bye.